Welcome back to the channel where we dive deep into the strange, dramatic, and often brutal realities of history. Today, we're drifting into the dangerous world of the Tudor court to uncover the truth behind a life that many people imagine is glamorous and luxurious. Being a princess might sound like a dream of beautiful gowns, grand palaces, and royal privilege. But in Tudor England, the reality was far darker. In this video, we'll explore why life was absolutely miserable for two of the most famous royal sisters in history, Mary I of England and Elizabeth I of England. From family betrayals and political conspiracies to imprisonment and constant fear, their lives were anything but a fairy tale. Both women were daughters of the powerful and unpredictable King Henry VIII, and growing up in his court meant that love, loyalty, and even survival could change overnight. So what was it really like to grow up as a Tudor princess? Why did these two sisters spend much of their lives fearing each other and fearing for their own lives? Stay with us as we uncover the shocking reality behind royal life in Tudor England. But before we begin, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another journey into the darker side of history. Now let's step back into the 16th century and discover why being a Tudor princess truly sucked. Imagine being born into one of the most powerful families in the world. The moment you enter life, bells ring across the kingdom, nobles celebrate your birth, and servants rush to prepare a future filled with luxury and privilege. Your cradle is not an ordinary one. It is carved from the finest wood, surrounded by silk curtains, and guarded by loyal attendants. Your clothes are made from expensive fabrics, your food is prepared by the best cooks in the country, and your future seems guaranteed to be one of honor, power, and admiration. To most people, being born a princess sounds like the perfect life. But in Tudor England, that dream often turned into something very different. Behind the glittering palaces and magnificent ceremonies, royal life was filled with fear, politics, and ruthless struggles for power. A princess might grow up surrounded by beauty and comfort, but she was also trapped in a world where every word, every friendship, and every decision could become dangerous. Royal children were not simply members of a family, they were political pieces in a game that could decide the fate of an entire nation. Few people understood this reality better than two famous daughters of the Tudor dynasty, Mary I of England and Elizabeth I of England. Both were born as princesses of England, daughters of the powerful King Henry VIII. Both entered the world surrounded by celebration and royal ceremony. And both would eventually rise to the throne and become queens of England. But before they ever wore crowns, their lives were filled with uncertainty, humiliation, danger, and fear. Their childhoods were shaped not by fairy tale happiness but by political turmoil and family conflict. They lived in a court where loyalty could change overnight and where even members of the royal family could fall from favor in an instant. To understand why being a Tudor princess could be so miserable, it helps to understand the world they were born into. Tudor England was a time of dramatic change and intense political tension. The country had only recently emerged from decades of civil war known as the Wars of the Roses, a brutal conflict between rival royal families fighting for the throne. The Tudor dynasty itself had come to power only a generation earlier, and its grip on the throne was not as secure as it might have seemed. The Tudor monarchs ruled with enormous authority, but they also faced constant threats from political rivals, rebellious nobles, and foreign powers. Royal marriages were arranged not for love but for political advantage. Alliances with other kingdoms were carefully negotiated, and every royal child could play a role in strengthening or weakening the position of the crown. For princesses, this meant that their lives were rarely their own. From the moment they were born, they were expected to serve the interests of the kingdom. Their education, their friendships, and even their future marriages were carefully planned by powerful adults who viewed them as valuable political tools. A Tudor princess might grow up in magnificent surroundings, but she had very little freedom. Her days were carefully structured and supervised by tutors, attendants, and advisors. She was expected to learn languages, music, religion, and courtly manners so that she could one day represent England with dignity and intelligence. Every gesture and every word mattered, because a royal daughter was constantly being judged by ambassadors, nobles, and members of the court. Yet even this strict upbringing could not prepare a princess for the dangers that lurked within the royal family itself. In Tudor England, family relationships were often overshadowed by political ambition. Loyalty to the crown sometimes meant turning against relatives, and royal favor could shift with frightening speed. Nowhere was this more true than in the court of King Henry VIII. Henry VIII is one of the most famous kings in English history, known for his dramatic personality, his political decisions, and his 6 marriages. He ruled England for nearly 4 decades, and during that time his court became one of the most powerful and influential in Europe. But Henry VIII was also unpredictable and deeply determined to secure the future of his dynasty. Like many kings of his time, he believed that a strong male heir was essential for the stability of the kingdom. Without a son to inherit the throne, England could once again fall into political chaos. This obsession with producing a male heir would shape the lives of his daughters in ways they could never have imagined. At the beginning of his reign, Henry seemed to have a stable and respectable marriage with his first wife, the Spanish Princess Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was admired across Europe for her intelligence, dignity, and strong religious faith. When she gave birth to a daughter in 1516, the child was celebrated across England. That child was Mary. For several years, Mary was treated as the pride of the kingdom. She was the king's only surviving child, and although Henry desperately wanted a son, he still showed affection for his young daughter. Mary received an education that was unusual for a girl at the time. She studied languages, philosophy, and music, and she grew up surrounded by the culture and ceremony of the royal court. To an outside observer, Mary's life might have looked like a fairy tale, but even during her earliest years her position was uncertain. In Tudor politics, the birth of a daughter was never as secure as the birth of a son. A princess might be loved and respected, but she could never fully guarantee the stability of the dynasty. As Mary grew older, Henry's desire for a male heir became more desperate. Catherine had experienced several pregnancies, but many of her children died shortly after birth. Each loss increased Henry's fear that the Tudor line might end without a son to continue it. This fear slowly transformed the atmosphere of the royal court. What had once seemed like a stable marriage began to fracture under the pressure of political and personal disappointment. Meanwhile, another young girl would soon enter the royal story, one whose life would become just as dramatic and dangerous as Mary's. That girl was Elizabeth. Elizabeth's arrival would be surrounded by excitement, controversy, and eventually tragedy. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, would become one of the most famous and controversial queens in English history. Anne's rise to power would transform the political landscape of England and trigger a religious revolution that reshaped the country forever. But long before Elizabeth understood any of this, she was simply a child born into the most powerful family in the nation. Like Mary before her, Elizabeth's life began with celebration. Yet the same political forces that would eventually destroy her mother would also place Elizabeth in constant danger. The Tudor court was a place where fortunes changed quickly. One day a nobleman could enjoy the king's favor and influence, and the next day he might be arrested and executed for treason. The same was true for members of the royal family. For princesses like Mary and Elizabeth, this meant that their lives were always connected to the ambitions and decisions of the king. They had no control over the political storms that surrounded them, yet those storms would determine their futures. Every new marriage of Henry VIII created new tensions within the royal family. Each new queen brought new allies and new rivalries to court. Every birth, every rumor, and every political alliance had the potential to shift the balance of power. In such an environment, even children could become threats. A royal daughter might one day become queen, especially if no male heir survived. That possibility meant that different factions at court might support or oppose her depending on their own political goals. Some nobles might see a princess as the key to their own influence, while others might view her as a dangerous rival. Because of this, Tudor princesses were rarely allowed to live carefree childhoods. They were raised in a world of careful observation and strict control. Their tutors, guardians, and attendants constantly reminded them of their duties and responsibilities. But no amount of preparation could fully protect them from the harsh realities of royal politics. Mary and Elizabeth would both experience dramatic rises and devastating falls during their early lives. Each would see her mother disgraced. Each would be declared illegitimate by her own father. Each would face suspicion, imprisonment, and the threat of execution. These experiences would shape their personalities and their future reigns as queens. Mary would grow into a ruler determined to restore the religious traditions of her mother, while Elizabeth would become famous for her cautious political strategy and her ability to survive in dangerous circumstances. Yet before they became queens, before they gained power and influence, they were simply 2 young girls growing up in one of the most dangerous royal courts in European history. From the outside, the life of a Tudor princess might have looked glamorous and privileged, but the reality was far more complicated. Royal birth brought wealth, status, and education, but it also brought expectations, pressure, and constant risk. Every decision made by the king could transform the future of his daughters. Every political crisis could place them in danger. In Tudor England, being born into the royal family was not simply a blessing. It was a responsibility, a burden, and sometimes even a curse. For Mary and Elizabeth, the title of princess did not guarantee happiness or security. Instead, it placed them directly in the path of some of the most dramatic and dangerous events in English history. And as their stories unfolded, it would become clear that surviving life as a Tudor princess required intelligence, resilience, and an extraordinary ability to endure hardship. Because in the world of the Tudors, crowns could be gained, but they could also be lost, and sometimes the most dangerous place to stand was right next to the throne. The year was 1516, and across England church bells rang in celebration. After years of uncertainty, the royal court finally had a healthy child born to the king and queen. The baby was a girl, but she was welcomed with joy and relief because she had survived infancy, something that had tragically taken the lives of several children born to the royal couple before her. This child was Mary I of England, the daughter of the powerful King Henry VIII and his respected queen, Catherine of Aragon. Mary's birth brought happiness to the English court. Although Henry had hoped for a son who would one day inherit the throne, the survival of a healthy royal child still meant stability for the Tudor dynasty. In the early years of her life, Mary was treated with extraordinary care and attention. She was the center of royal celebrations, admired by nobles, and cherished by her mother. Catherine of Aragon was a devoted mother who took great pride in her daughter. Catherine herself was the daughter of the famous Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, rulers who had united Spain and strengthened its power in Europe. She brought with her a strong sense of royal dignity, religious devotion, and education. Catherine believed that a princess should be intelligent, cultured, and morally upright, and she made sure Mary received the best education available. From a young age, Mary showed signs of intelligence and determination. She learned Latin, Spanish, and French, and she studied music, literature, and religion. Visitors to the court often commented on her impressive manners and sharp mind. By the time she was a child, Mary could already play musical instruments and converse politely with ambassadors from foreign countries. For a time, Mary's future looked bright. She was often treated almost like the heir to the throne. Henry VIII was proud of her talents and frequently displayed her abilities in front of important visitors. Diplomats from Europe were impressed by her education and charm, and many believed she would become one of the most accomplished royal women of her generation. Like most princesses of the time, Mary's future marriage was already being discussed while she was still very young. Royal marriages were rarely based on love. Instead, they were powerful political tools used to strengthen alliances between kingdoms. A princess might marry a foreign prince or king in order to create peace, secure military support, or strengthen economic ties. Mary became a valuable diplomatic asset. When she was just 2 years old, plans were already being discussed to marry her to the French heir to the throne. Later, other potential matches were considered, including powerful nobles and princes from across Europe. Each proposal reflected how important Mary was in the political strategies of her father. But while Mary's life appeared secure, there was a shadow hanging over the Tudor court. King Henry VIII desperately wanted a son. In the early 1500s, the idea of a woman ruling England was deeply controversial. Although it was technically possible for a queen to inherit the throne, many people feared that female rulers might lead to instability or political weakness. Henry knew the history of England's civil wars, particularly the devastating Wars of the Roses that had nearly destroyed the kingdom before the Tudors came to power. To Henry, a male heir represented safety for the dynasty. A son would inherit the throne smoothly and continue the Tudor line without the risk of political chaos. Unfortunately, Catherine of Aragon had suffered multiple tragic pregnancies. Several babies were born but died shortly afterward, and others were stillborn. Each loss caused heartbreak for the royal couple and increased Henry's anxiety about the future. As the years passed and no surviving son appeared, Henry began to question whether his marriage to Catherine was somehow cursed or invalid. At first these doubts remained private, but eventually they became impossible to ignore. Around this time a young woman named Anne Boleyn began to attract the king's attention. Anne was intelligent, ambitious, and unlike many women at court. She refused to become Henry's mistress and instead insisted that if the king wanted her affection, he would have to marry her. Henry became obsessed with the idea. This desire created a political crisis that would change England forever. Henry believed that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon should be annulled. He argued that the marriage was invalid because Catherine had previously been married to his older brother, Arthur. According to Henry's interpretation of religious law, marrying his brother's widow might have angered God and caused the lack of a male heir. Catherine strongly rejected this claim. She insisted that her marriage to Arthur had never been fully completed and that her union with Henry was legitimate in the eyes of God. The issue quickly turned into a major dispute involving the Catholic Church. Henry needed permission from the Pope to end his marriage to Catherine. However, the Pope faced enormous political pressure from Catherine's powerful relatives in Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. For years the matter remained unresolved. During this time, Mary was caught in the middle of a growing conflict between her parents. As a young girl, Mary loved both her father and her mother deeply. She had been raised to respect them and to believe that their marriage was honorable and sacred. When rumors began spreading about Henry's desire to marry Anne Boleyn, Mary found herself facing a painful reality she could not fully understand. The tension within the royal family grew stronger with each passing year. Eventually, Henry made a decision that shocked Europe. Unable to obtain the annulment he wanted from the Catholic Church, he chose to break away from the authority of the Pope entirely. This decision triggered the dramatic transformation known as the English Reformation. Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church in England. This meant that he no longer needed the Pope's approval to end his marriage. In 1533, he officially separated from Catherine of Aragon and married Anne Boleyn. For Mary, the consequences were devastating. Her mother was removed from court and forced to live in isolation, separated from her daughter. Catherine was no longer recognized as queen, and Mary was forbidden from seeing her for long periods of time. The emotional pain of this separation deeply affected Mary, who remained fiercely loyal to her mother. But the political consequences were even worse. Because Henry now considered his marriage to Catherine invalid, he also declared that Mary had been born illegitimate. In other words, she was no longer recognized as the rightful daughter of the king and queen. Her title of princess was taken away. Instead of being called Princess Mary, she was now referred to simply as Lady Mary. This change may sound small, but in the world of Tudor politics it was enormous. A princess had status, power, and a clear place in the line of succession. An illegitimate daughter had none of these protections. Mary's household was broken apart. Many of her loyal servants were dismissed, and she was forced to move to a smaller residence. The luxurious life she had once known was suddenly replaced with uncertainty and humiliation. Even worse, Mary was pressured to acknowledge that her parents' marriage had been invalid and that Anne Boleyn was the rightful queen. Accepting this would mean betraying her mother, something Mary refused to do. Her refusal angered the king. Henry VIII was known for his temper and his determination to get his way. When Mary resisted his demands, she faced increasing pressure and intimidation from royal officials who wanted her to submit. Mary's stubborn loyalty to Catherine of Aragon placed her in serious danger. In Tudor England, disobeying the king could be interpreted as treason, one of the most serious crimes imaginable. Yet Mary continued to stand by her mother. As the situation worsened, Mary became increasingly isolated. She was separated not only from her mother, but also from many of the people who had once supported her. Some members of the court avoided her out of fear that they might anger the king. Meanwhile, Anne Boleyn gave birth to a daughter in 1533. That daughter was Elizabeth. Mary now faced a humiliating new reality. She was forced to serve in the household of the infant Elizabeth, the child of the woman who had replaced her mother as queen. For a young girl who had once been treated as the pride of England, this was an enormous emotional blow. Mary's health also began to suffer. Stress, anxiety, and loneliness affected her physically as well as emotionally. Historical records suggest that she experienced periods of illness during these difficult years. Despite everything, Mary continued to hold firmly to her beliefs. She remained a devout Catholic like her mother and refused to accept the religious changes that were sweeping through England. This stubborn strength would later shape her actions as queen, but during her youth it made her life even more difficult. The tragedy deepened in 1536 when Catherine of Aragon died. Mary had not been allowed to see her mother for years before her death, a loss that caused profound grief. With Catherine gone, Mary lost her strongest supporter. Yet fate was about to shift once again. Only a few months after Catherine's death, the political winds at court changed dramatically. Anne Boleyn, once the most powerful woman in England, suddenly fell from the king's favor. She was arrested and accused of adultery, treason, and other shocking crimes. In one of the most dramatic moments in Tudor history, Anne was executed. The downfall of Anne Boleyn transformed the atmosphere of the royal court once again. Although Mary's status was still uncertain, the removal of Anne meant that one of her greatest enemies was gone. Over time, Mary was pressured to sign a document acknowledging Henry as the head of the Church of England and accepting her illegitimate status. Under enormous pressure and fearing for her safety, Mary eventually agreed. This decision allowed her to return to a more stable position within the royal family, though she was never fully restored to her original status as princess during Henry's lifetime. Mary had experienced humiliation, loss, and political danger before she was even 20 years old. The daughter who had once been celebrated across England had watched her entire world collapse because of her father's decisions. Her story shows just how fragile royal privilege could be in Tudor England. For Mary, being born a princess had once promised honor and security. Instead, it brought heartbreak, danger, and a constant struggle to protect her identity and beliefs. And as the years passed, the lessons she learned during this painful period would shape the queen she would eventually become. In the autumn of 1533, the English court once again celebrated the birth of a royal child. Trumpets sounded through the halls of the palace, messengers carried the news across the kingdom, and courtiers prepared ceremonies to honor the arrival of the newest member of the royal family. The child was a daughter, and she was named Elizabeth I of England. She was the daughter of the powerful English King Henry VIII and his new queen, Anne Boleyn. For Henry, this birth was supposed to mark the beginning of a new and glorious chapter in his dynasty. After years of political struggle and personal determination, he had finally managed to set aside his first wife and marry the woman he believed would give him the male heir he so desperately wanted. The story of Elizabeth's birth cannot be understood without understanding the dramatic events that led to it. Henry's decision to marry Anne Boleyn had already shaken the foundations of English society. In order to make Anne his queen, Henry had taken the extraordinary step of breaking away from the authority of the Catholic Church. This break triggered the enormous religious and political transformation known as the English Reformation. Through this change, Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church in England, removing the authority of the Pope. This decision not only allowed him to marry Anne Boleyn but also changed the religious structure of the entire kingdom. Monasteries would later be dissolved, church lands would be seized, and the relationship between religion and royal power would be permanently altered. All of these dramatic changes were connected, in one way or another, to Henry's desire to produce a male heir. When Anne Boleyn became pregnant shortly after her marriage to Henry, excitement swept through the royal court. Many believed that this pregnancy would finally produce the son the king had long desired. Preparations were made for the birth of a prince. Ceremonies were planned, and expectations grew that the Tudor dynasty would soon have the strong male successor Henry had been seeking for so many years. But when the baby was born in September 1533, it was not the prince Henry had hoped for. It was a girl. This girl was Elizabeth. At first, the disappointment may have been hidden behind polite celebration. Official announcements still praised the birth of a healthy royal child. Elizabeth was baptized in a grand ceremony attended by many important nobles and church leaders. Her godparents were chosen from among the most powerful figures in England, and her early days were filled with the rituals expected for a royal infant. However, behind the scenes, Henry's frustration began to grow. Although he cared for Elizabeth, the king's primary concern remained the same: the survival of the Tudor dynasty through a male heir. The birth of another daughter meant that the problem he had tried so hard to solve had not yet been resolved. Anne Boleyn, meanwhile, understood the pressure she faced. Her position as queen depended heavily on her ability to produce a son. Without a male heir, her enemies at court could easily use the king's disappointment as an opportunity to weaken her influence. The Tudor court was full of ambitious nobles who carefully watched the balance of power around them. Anne had risen quickly from a noblewoman to queen, and many people resented her success. Some remained loyal to Catherine of Aragon, Henry's former wife, while others simply feared Anne's political influence. As time passed and Anne failed to produce a surviving son, the atmosphere at court became increasingly tense. Elizabeth herself was too young to understand any of this. As a small child, she lived under the care of nurses, tutors, and attendants who managed every part of her daily life. Like most royal infants of the time, she was raised away from the constant activity of the main court, living in carefully supervised royal households designed to provide safety and education. Yet the political storm surrounding her parents continued to grow. Anne Boleyn suffered several pregnancies after Elizabeth's birth, but none produced a surviving male heir. Each loss weakened her position and increased the king's frustration. The same determination that had once driven Henry to break away from the Catholic Church now began to turn against the woman he had fought so hard to marry. By the mid-1530s, Anne's enemies were becoming more confident. Rumors began to circulate through the court, accusing her of various forms of misconduct and betrayal. Some of these accusations were likely exaggerated or even invented by political rivals who hoped to remove her from power. In 1536, the situation reached a shocking climax. Anne Boleyn was arrested and charged with a series of serious crimes, including adultery and treason. These accusations were extraordinary because they suggested that the Queen had betrayed the king and endangered the stability of the kingdom itself. Historians still debate the truth of these charges. Many believe that the accusations were politically motivated, designed to remove Anne and allow Henry to marry again in his continuing search for a male heir. Whatever the truth may have been, the outcome was swift and brutal. Anne Boleyn was found guilty and sentenced to death. In May 1536 she was executed in one of the most dramatic moments in Tudor history, remembered today as the execution of Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth was only 2 years old when her mother died. Although she was far too young to remember the event clearly, the consequences of Anne's execution would shape Elizabeth's entire life. Just as Mary had experienced years earlier, Elizabeth was now declared illegitimate. Henry VIII announced that his marriage to Anne Boleyn had been invalid, which meant that Elizabeth was no longer considered a legitimate royal princess. Her title was removed. Like Mary before her, she was no longer called Princess Elizabeth. Instead, she was referred to as Lady Elizabeth. This decision had enormous political significance. Being illegitimate meant that Elizabeth no longer had a clear claim to the throne. Her position within the royal family became uncertain, and her future depended entirely on the decisions of her powerful father. Soon after Anne's execution, Henry married another woman, Jane Seymour. Jane quickly gained favor with the king and became Queen of England. Unlike Anne, Jane managed to give Henry the son he had always wanted. In 1537, she gave birth to a boy who would become Edward VI of England. The birth of Edward changed everything. For the first time, Henry finally had a legitimate male heir. The existence of a prince greatly strengthened the Tudor dynasty and reduced the immediate importance of his daughters. For Mary and Elizabeth, this meant that their positions became even more uncertain. Although they were still recognized as members of the royal family, their roles in the line of succession were unclear, and their political value shifted depending on the king's decisions. Elizabeth's childhood unfolded in this complicated and unpredictable environment. Despite the political turmoil surrounding her birth, Elizabeth received an excellent education. Like Mary, she was taught by some of the most respected scholars of the time. Her tutors introduced her to languages, philosophy, literature, and history. She studied Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, developing a reputation for intelligence and curiosity. Elizabeth quickly showed remarkable intellectual ability. She enjoyed learning and demonstrated a talent for languages and debate. Many of the people who taught her later remembered her as an unusually bright and thoughtful student. However, her education also included lessons about survival in the dangerous world of Tudor politics. Elizabeth grew up watching how quickly fortunes could change at court. She knew that her own mother had once been the most powerful woman in England before being suddenly arrested and executed. This knowledge left a deep impression on her personality. As she grew older, Elizabeth developed a cautious and observant nature. She learned to listen carefully, speak thoughtfully, and avoid revealing too much about her opinions or intentions. These skills would later become some of her greatest strengths as queen. During her childhood, Elizabeth also experienced a complicated relationship with her half-sister Mary. The two girls had different mothers and had lived through very different experiences, but they shared one important similarity. Both had been declared illegitimate by their own father. For a time, Mary had even been forced to serve in Elizabeth's household when Anne Boleyn was queen. This situation had been humiliating for Mary and created tension between the sisters. Despite these difficulties, the two girls occasionally developed moments of cooperation and mutual understanding. Both had experienced the unpredictable nature of their father's rule, and both understood that their survival depended on navigating the political environment carefully. Elizabeth's position within the royal family continued to change as Henry VIII entered additional marriages after Jane Seymour's death. Each new queen brought new alliances and new rivalries to the court. The constant changes in Henry's relationships created an atmosphere where loyalty and power shifted frequently. Members of the royal family had to remain alert and cautious, knowing that favor with the king could disappear at any moment. For Elizabeth, these experiences shaped her understanding of politics from a very young age. Although she had once been born as a princess with great expectations, she now lived in a world where her status depended entirely on the decisions of others. She had seen her mother rise to power and fall to execution. She had watched her sister lose and regain favor with the king. The lesson was clear. In Tudor England, royal birth could bring both privilege and danger. Elizabeth learned to adapt to this reality. She focused on her education, developed strong relationships with trusted tutors, and carefully observed the complex politics of the court around her. These experiences helped shape the future queen who would one day rule England for more than 4 decades. But during her childhood, none of that success was guaranteed. Instead, Elizabeth lived with the knowledge that her life had already been shaped by tragedy and political conflict. The daughter of a fallen queen, she grew up in a world where survival required intelligence, patience, and caution, and the challenges she faced as a young girl would prepare her for the even greater trials that awaited her in the turbulent years ahead. By the late 1530s and early 1540s, the lives of Mary I of England and Elizabeth I of England had already been shaped by dramatic changes within the royal family. Both had experienced the shocking fall of their mothers, both had been declared illegitimate by their own father, and both had learned that life in the Tudor court could change suddenly and without warning. Although they were half-sisters, their relationship was never simple. They were born to different mothers, raised under different circumstances, and surrounded by different political supporters. Yet they shared the same powerful and unpredictable father, Henry VIII, whose decisions continued to influence every aspect of their lives. As children growing up in the Tudor court, Mary and Elizabeth lived under constant observation. Every noble family, every foreign ambassador, and every religious leader understood that the daughters of Henry VIII might one day become queens of England. That possibility made them both important and dangerous figures within the political landscape of the kingdom. Their differences began with religion, an issue that had become deeply divisive in England during their father's reign. Mary had been raised by her mother, Catherine of Aragon, to be a devoted Catholic. Catherine believed strongly in the traditions and authority of the Catholic Church, and she passed those beliefs on to her daughter. Even after Henry broke away from Rome during the English Reformation, Mary remained loyal to the old faith. For Mary, religion was not simply a political matter. It was a deeply personal conviction tied to her loyalty to her mother and her belief in the authority of the Catholic Church. She believed that her parents' marriage had been valid, and that the religious changes introduced by her father were wrong. Elizabeth's upbringing was different. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been closely connected to the reformist ideas that were spreading across Europe during the early 16th century. Many historians believe Anne supported certain religious reforms that questioned the authority of the Catholic Church and encouraged new interpretations of Christian scripture. After Anne's execution, Elizabeth was raised by tutors who were influenced by the intellectual and religious movements of the time. These tutors introduced her to ideas that would later be associated with Protestantism, a form of Christianity that rejected the authority of the Pope and emphasized individual interpretation of the Bible. As a result, the two sisters gradually became associated with different religious traditions. Mary represented the Catholic past that had shaped England for centuries. Elizabeth appeared to represent the Protestant future that was beginning to emerge during the Reformation. This difference was not merely a matter of personal belief. In Tudor England, religion and politics were deeply connected. Supporting one religious position often meant supporting a particular vision for the future of the kingdom. Because of this, powerful nobles and political groups sometimes viewed Mary and Elizabeth as symbols of different possibilities for England's future. Yet their situation was complicated by their uncertain legal status. Even though both sisters had once been declared illegitimate, Henry VIII eventually decided to restore them to the line of succession. In 1544 he passed a law known as the Third Succession Act, which allowed Mary and Elizabeth to inherit the throne if their younger half-brother, Edward VI of England, died without heirs. This decision did not fully restore their legitimacy, but it placed them back into the political spotlight. Now the daughters of Henry VIII were once again potential future rulers of England. As a result, both sisters lived under constant scrutiny. Courtiers, nobles, and foreign ambassadors watched them closely, trying to determine what kind of rulers they might become. Every action, every friendship, and every public statement could have political consequences. Mary, as the elder sister, held a slightly stronger claim to the throne. Many Catholic supporters believed she should eventually rule England and restore the country's traditional religious practices. Elizabeth, however, attracted attention from those who supported religious reform. They saw her education and upbringing as signs that she might continue the changes begun during Henry's break with the Catholic Church. The sisters themselves had to navigate this dangerous political environment carefully. Their relationship remained cautious and sometimes distant. They lived in separate households for much of their youth and were surrounded by different advisors and supporters. Although they occasionally communicated and appeared together at court, their interactions were shaped by the political tensions surrounding them. Both Mary and Elizabeth understood that their safety depended on avoiding actions that could be interpreted as rebellion or disloyalty. During the final years of Henry VII's life, the political atmosphere in England remained unstable. The king continued to make important decisions about religion and government, while powerful nobles competed for influence at court. When Henry died in 1547, the situation became even more uncertain. The throne passed to his only legitimate son, Edward VI. Edward was only 9 years old when he became king, meaning that real power was held by a group of advisors who ruled in his name. Edward had been raised with strong Protestant beliefs, and his advisors supported religious reform. During his reign, England moved further away from Catholic traditions and adopted new Protestant policies. For Mary, these changes were deeply troubling. She remained firmly committed to the Catholic faith and refused to abandon her religious practices. This refusal created tension between her and the government of her younger brother. Edward's advisors viewed Mary's Catholic beliefs as a potential political threat. They worried that if she became queen, she might reverse the religious reforms they had introduced. Despite these tensions, Mary managed to avoid direct conflict during Edward's reign. She lived relatively quietly, maintaining her religious practices and waiting to see how the political situation would develop. Elizabeth, meanwhile, continued her education and carefully observed the shifting power dynamics around her. Although she was associated with Protestant reform, Elizabeth was cautious about expressing strong political opinions. She had learned from the tragic fate of her mother that revealing too much could be dangerous. Her intelligence and self-control helped her navigate the complex politics of Edward's court. Still, both sisters understood that their futures were uncertain. If Edward married and had children, Mary and Elizabeth might never come close to the throne. But if something happened to him, the question of succession could quickly become a matter of intense political struggle. In Tudor England, the death of a monarch without a clear heir often led to conflict. Noble families might support different candidates for the throne. Foreign powers might attempt to influence the outcome. Religious divisions could deepen political rivalries. Because Mary and Elizabeth represented different religious and political possibilities, their claims to the throne carried enormous significance. Even as young women, they lived with the knowledge that powerful groups might try to use them as symbols or leaders in future struggles for power. This constant awareness shaped their personalities in important ways. Mary developed a strong sense of determination and loyalty to her beliefs. She believed deeply in the Catholic faith and in the legitimacy of her mother's marriage to Henry VIII. These convictions gave her strength but also made her less willing to compromise with political opponents. Elizabeth, on the other hand, became famous for her caution and strategic thinking. She understood that survival in the Tudor court often required patience and flexibility. She learned to speak carefully, revealing only as much as necessary while keeping her true intentions hidden. These differences in personality would later influence their reigns as queens. But during their youth, both sisters faced the same fundamental challenge: surviving in a world where suspicion and ambition were everywhere. In the Tudor court, even a simple conversation could become dangerous if it was misunderstood or reported to the wrong person. Servants, courtiers, and nobles constantly observed each other, searching for signs of loyalty or betrayal. Letters could be intercepted, rumors could spread quickly, and accusations of treason could lead to imprisonment or execution. Mary and Elizabeth knew that their royal blood made them potential targets for political manipulation. If a rebellion occurred, conspirators might try to place one of them on the throne. If the king or his advisors suspected such a plot, they might respond harshly, even if the princess herself had no involvement. This constant tension created a life of careful behavior and limited freedom. Despite their wealth and education, the daughters of Henry VIII lived under restrictions that ordinary people rarely experienced. They could not choose their own marriages, form friendships freely, or express political opinions openly. Every aspect of their lives was connected to the future of the kingdom. For Mary and Elizabeth, growing up as Tudor princesses meant living in a world where power, religion, and family loyalty were tightly intertwined. Their experiences during these years would prepare them for the enormous responsibilities and dangers that awaited them in adulthood, because in Tudor England, the line between princess and prisoner could be frighteningly thin. And for these two sisters, the struggle to survive the politics of their father's dynasty was only just beginning. When Henry VIII died in 1547, the future of England entered a new and uncertain chapter. The powerful king who had dominated English politics for nearly 4 decades was gone, and the throne now belonged to his young son, Edward VI of England. Edward was only 9 years old when he became king, far too young to rule on his own. As a result, the country was governed by powerful nobles who acted as his protectors and advisors. For the daughters of Henry VII, Mary I of England, and Elizabeth I of England, this moment was both hopeful and dangerous. Their father had restored them to the line of succession before his death, meaning that if Edward died without children, the crown might eventually pass to one of them. But in Tudor England, being close to the throne could be as dangerous as it was prestigious. Edward VI had been raised as a strong supporter of Protestant reform. During his short reign, England moved further away from traditional Catholic practices and adopted new religious policies influenced by Protestant ideas spreading across Europe. Church services were changed, religious images were removed from churches, and new prayer books were introduced. The government encouraged Protestant teachings and tried to limit the influence of Catholic traditions. These changes created a serious problem for Mary. Mary remained deeply loyal to the Catholic faith she had inherited from her mother, Catherine of Aragon. She believed that the old religious traditions were correct and that the break from the Catholic Church had been a mistake. Even after her father's death, Mary continued to attend Catholic Mass and refused to abandon her beliefs. This decision placed her in direct conflict with the Protestant government ruling in Edward's name. According to the laws established by Henry VIII, the next person in line to the throne after Edward was Mary. Elizabeth would follow after her. But Edward and many of his Protestant advisors were deeply worried about the idea of Mary becoming queen. They feared that she would restore Catholicism and undo the religious reforms they had worked so hard to establish. In response, they attempted to change the line of succession. Edward supported a plan that would place the crown on the head of a young noblewoman named Lady Jane Grey, who had Protestant connections and could be controlled by powerful advisors. This plan was extremely controversial. It required ignoring the official succession laws established by Henry VIII and bypassing both Mary and Elizabeth. When Edward VI died in July 1553, the conspirators quickly declared Lady Jane Grey as queen. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the plan might succeed. But Mary moved quickly and decisively. Supported by many nobles and ordinary people who believed she was the rightful heir, Mary gathered allies and began raising support across the country. Her claim to the throne was based on her father's official laws, and many people saw her as the legitimate successor. Within days, public opinion shifted dramatically. The government in London abandoned Lady Jane Grey, and Mary was proclaimed the new Queen of England. The episode became known as the 9 Days' Reign of Lady Jane Grey, because Jane's rule lasted only 9 days before collapsing. Mary's victory marked a dramatic turning point in English history. For the first time, the daughter who had once been declared illegitimate and forced to serve in another princess's household was now the ruler of England. But for Elizabeth, this change also created new uncertainty. Although Elizabeth had not been involved in the attempt to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne, she still had to navigate the political consequences of Mary's rise to power. The sisters now stood on opposite sides of England's religious divide. Mary intended to restore Catholicism, while many of Elizabeth's supporters favored Protestant reforms. As Queen, Mary had enormous authority, and Elizabeth's future now depended largely on her sisters' decisions. Despite their complicated history, Mary initially treated Elizabeth with a degree of caution rather than hostility. Elizabeth was allowed to remain at court and continued to be recognized as the next heir to the throne. However, the political tensions surrounding religion and succession meant that Elizabeth's position remained fragile. In Tudor England, rivals to the throne could quickly become suspects in political conspiracies. And as Mary began her reign, it would not take long before Elizabeth once again found herself facing suspicion, danger, and the possibility that her life could be destroyed by forces beyond her control. For a Tudor princess, survival required intelligence, patience, and extraordinary resilience. And Elizabeth was about to face the most dangerous challenge of her life. By the time both sisters had reached adulthood, the rivalry between them was no longer just a family tension. It had become a matter of religion, politics, loyalty, and survival across all of England. Every noble household, every advisor at court, and every foreign ambassador understood that the future of the country might depend on which daughter of Henry VIII ultimately ruled. And for the daughters themselves, Mary I of England and Elizabeth I of England, the situation was deeply personal, painful, and dangerous. For Mary, the years before she became queen were filled with humiliation, anxiety, and fear. She had once been treated like the unquestioned heir to the throne. As the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, she was educated like a future monarch. She studied languages, music, religion, and diplomacy. She had been promised in marriage negotiations to powerful European princes. The entire royal court expected that she might one day rule England. But everything changed when her father fell in love with Anne Boleyn. The king's determination to marry Anne led to the dramatic break with the Roman Catholic Church. Mary's mother was cast aside, and Mary herself was declared illegitimate. Almost overnight she went from princess to something much closer to a political inconvenience. Mary refused to accept that her parents' marriage had been invalid. She believed firmly that her mother had been the rightful queen, and that the Church in Rome was the true authority in matters of faith. Because of this belief, she refused to sign documents acknowledging her own illegitimacy. This stubborn refusal made her father furious. At times, Mary's position became extremely dangerous. Royal advisors pressured her relentlessly to submit to the king's wishes. Some historians believe there were moments when her life might truly have been in danger if she continued resisting. Eventually, under enormous pressure, she signed the documents acknowledging her father as head of the Church of England and accepting her illegitimate status. But the emotional cost of that moment stayed with her forever. While Mary endured this painful fall from favor, Elizabeth's early childhood followed a strangely similar path, but for entirely different reasons. Elizabeth was born during the brief period when her mother Anne Boleyn held tremendous power at court. Her birth in 1533 had been celebrated across England with bells ringing and cannons firing. The king believed his new wife would give him the son he desperately wanted, and although Elizabeth was not the boy he hoped for, she was still initially treated as a valuable royal child. But Anne's fall from power was sudden and terrifying. In 1536 she was arrested, accused of treason, adultery, and conspiracy against the king. Within weeks she was executed. Elizabeth was only a toddler, yet the consequences of her mother's death would shape the rest of her life. Just like Mary before her, Elizabeth was declared illegitimate. Her royal household was dissolved, servants were dismissed. Her status as princess was removed, and she was referred to simply as Lady Elizabeth. For a young child, the political meaning of these changes might not have been clear, but the instability certainly was. Growing up in the Tudor court meant constantly watching people rise and fall from power, sometimes violently. Elizabeth learned very early that survival depended on caution, intelligence, and emotional control. The court itself was a dangerous environment filled with rival factions. Nobles competed for influence with the king, ambassadors reported every rumor back to their home countries, and religious tensions simmered beneath the surface. The Protestant Reformation had begun to reshape England, and loyalty to different religious beliefs could easily become a life-or-death matter. Mary remained firmly Catholic, shaped by her devotion to her mother and to the old church. Elizabeth, however, grew up during a time when Protestant ideas were spreading through the kingdom. Her tutors exposed her to humanist learning and reformist theology. Over time, her religious views developed differently from Mary's. This difference would later become one of the most dangerous divisions between the sisters. Despite their separate households and complicated histories, there were moments when Mary and Elizabeth attempted to maintain a relationship. They were sisters after all, even if politics constantly tried to turn them into enemies. But trust between them was always fragile. Mary never forgot that Elizabeth was the daughter of the woman she believed had destroyed her mother's marriage and position. Elizabeth, on the other hand, understood that Mary's supporters often viewed her as illegitimate and potentially dangerous. Foreign powers also played a role in increasing the tension. Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire all watched England closely, hoping to influence its future. Each nation had its own preferred candidate for the English throne. For many Catholic leaders in Europe, Mary represented stability and religious loyalty. She was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess, and her Catholic faith aligned closely with powerful continental monarchs. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was seen by many Protestants as the symbol of a different future, one where England remained independent from papal authority and continued moving toward religious reform. As the years passed, these political and religious divisions deepened. When Henry VIII died in 1547, the throne passed not to either of his daughters but to his young son, Edward VI of England. Edward was only 9 years old, and real power rested in the hands of regents who governed in his name. Edward's reign accelerated the Protestant transformation of England. New religious laws reshaped church practices, Catholic rituals were removed, and reformist theology became official policy. For Mary, this period was incredibly difficult. She refused to abandon her Catholic beliefs, even when pressured by the government. At times she openly defied royal orders by continuing to attend Catholic Mass in her private chapel. This act of resistance brought her into direct conflict with Edward's advisors. Several confrontations occurred, and some members of the government even discussed arresting her. Elizabeth, by contrast, navigated the political climate with extreme caution. She rarely spoke openly about her religious beliefs, and carefully avoided actions that might anger those in power. Her intelligence and restraint allowed her to survive this dangerous period without becoming a target. But the real crisis came in 1553 when Edward VI fell gravely ill. Because Edward was Protestant and feared that Mary would restore Catholicism if she became queen, a group of powerful nobles attempted to change the line of succession. They supported a distant relative, Lady Jane Grey, as the new ruler of England. For 9 dramatic days, England had a different queen, but the plan quickly collapsed. Mary gathered supporters across the country, and the people of England rallied behind her legitimate claim to the throne. Within weeks, she marched into London in triumph and was proclaimed queen. Mary had finally regained the position she believed was rightfully hers all along. Yet becoming queen did not erase the years of suffering she had endured. Mary's reign was driven by a powerful desire to restore Catholicism to England. She believed that her country had been led astray and that it was her duty to bring it back to the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. Unfortunately, the methods used to achieve this goal became some of the most controversial actions in English history. Protestants who refused to convert were arrested, tried for heresy, and executed. These burnings earned Mary the infamous nickname Bloody Mary in later Protestant histories. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's position during Mary's reign was extremely precarious. Many Protestants viewed Elizabeth as their preferred future queen. As a result, several plots and rebellions attempted to place her on the throne. Even when Elizabeth had no involvement in these conspiracies, suspicion constantly surrounded her. At one point, she was imprisoned in the Tower of London, the same fortress where her mother had once been held before execution. For weeks, Elizabeth feared that she might share Anne Boleyn's fate. Although Mary eventually released her, the relationship between the sisters was never the same. Mary ruled England for 5 difficult years before her health began to fail. When she died in 1558 without a child, the crown passed to the one person she had always viewed with both suspicion and reluctant acceptance. Elizabeth became queen. For Elizabeth, the lessons of her childhood shaped every decision she made as ruler. She understood the dangers of court politics, the volatility of religion, and the importance of maintaining control over her public image. Her reign would last more than 40 years and become known as the Elizabethan Age, a period of cultural achievement, exploration, and political stability. But the strength she showed as queen had been forged through years of fear, uncertainty, and survival. When people imagine life as a Tudor princess, they often picture luxury, beautiful dresses, grand palaces, and royal privilege. And while those things certainly existed, the reality for Mary and Elizabeth was far darker. Their childhoods were shaped by political marriages, religious conflict, betrayal, and the constant possibility of losing everything, including their lives. Both sisters experienced the humiliation of illegitimacy, the danger of court intrigue, and the loneliness of growing up in a world where trust was rare. Mary's story is one of perseverance through rejection and humiliation, ultimately achieving the crown she believed was her destiny. Elizabeth's story is one of careful survival, learning from every danger she faced until she became one of England's most famous monarchs. Yet beneath their rivalry and political differences, their lives reveal the same brutal truth. Being born a Tudor princess did not guarantee happiness, safety, or love. In fact, it often meant the exact opposite. By the time Elizabeth I of England finally took the throne in 1558, after the death of her half-sister Mary I of England, England had already endured decades of religious conflict, political anxiety, and dramatic shifts in power. For Elizabeth, becoming queen was not simply a moment of triumph. It was the beginning of a constant balancing act shaped by everything she had witnessed during her childhood and youth. Elizabeth understood something better than almost anyone else in Europe. The throne of England was never truly secure. She had seen her own mother, Anne Boleyn, executed on accusations that many historians still debate today. She had watched her sister Mary struggle through humiliation and political danger before eventually claiming the crown. She had experienced imprisonment in the Tower of London and the constant suspicion that she might be executed as a political threat. These experiences shaped Elizabeth's personality in profound ways. Unlike many monarchs who ruled with impulsive emotion, Elizabeth became incredibly cautious. She carefully controlled her words, her public image, and even her personal relationships. One of the most famous examples of this caution was her decision never to marry. In the 16th century, a queen ruling alone was considered extremely unusual and even dangerous. Advisors, members of parliament, and foreign leaders all expected Elizabeth to marry and produce an heir. Marriage alliances were one of the most important tools of diplomacy at the time. Through marriage, kingdoms could secure peace, strengthen alliances, and prevent wars. Yet Elizabeth resisted these pressures throughout her entire life. Part of this decision likely came from observing the disastrous marriages around her. Her father, Henry VIII, had married 6 times, and 2 of his wives had been executed. The destruction of her mother's marriage had reshaped the entire political and religious structure of England. Her sister Mary had also married, choosing the powerful Spanish Prince Philip II of Spain. That marriage had been deeply unpopular in England. Many people feared that the country would fall under Spanish influence or control. The union even triggered a rebellion known as Wyatt's Rebellion, which sought to stop the marriage and place Elizabeth on the throne instead. Watching these events unfold likely convinced Elizabeth that marriage could create more political problems than it solved. Instead, Elizabeth crafted a new identity for herself, one that became central to her power. She portrayed herself as the Virgin Queen, symbolically married to England itself. This image allowed her to maintain independence while still projecting loyalty and devotion to her country. It was a clever political strategy. By remaining unmarried, Elizabeth avoided the risk of a foreign prince gaining influence over England's government. She also used the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic tool, entertaining proposals from various European princes, without ever committing to any of them. This allowed her to keep foreign powers interested in maintaining good relations with England. But even as queen, Elizabeth's life was never free from danger. The religious divide that had defined her childhood continued to threaten the stability of her reign. Elizabeth attempted to create a compromise religious system known as the Elizabethan settlement, which re-established the Church of England while avoiding some of the more extreme Protestant reforms introduced during the reign of Edward VI of England. Her goal was stability rather than ideological purity. However, not everyone accepted this compromise. Some Catholics believed Elizabeth's rule was illegitimate because she had been declared illegitimate earlier in her life. Others believed England should return fully to the authority of the Pope. At the same time, more radical Protestants believed Elizabeth's reforms did not go far enough. This meant that Elizabeth constantly faced threats from multiple sides. One of the most dangerous challenges to her rule came from another royal woman, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary Stuart had a strong claim to the English throne through her Tudor ancestry. She was also Catholic, which made her a powerful symbol for those who opposed Elizabeth's Protestant government. After political turmoil forced Mary to flee Scotland, she sought refuge in England. But welcoming Mary created an enormous problem for Elizabeth. If Mary remained free, she could become the center of plots and rebellions against the English crown. Yet executing a fellow queen carried enormous political and moral consequences. For nearly 20 years, Elizabeth kept Mary under house arrest. During this time, several conspiracies emerged that aimed to overthrow Elizabeth and replace her with Mary. One of the most famous of these plots was the Babington Plot, which involved plans to assassinate Elizabeth and restore Catholic rule in England. When evidence emerged suggesting that Mary had supported the plot, Elizabeth faced the most difficult decision of her reign. After years of hesitation, she finally approved Mary's execution in 1587,